Welcome, everyone. This is the third annual CASL Faculty Research Slam. Appreciate you taking time out of your day to come and hear our faculty talk in very concise and in a concise and accessible way about their research. We're trying something a little different this year. Presentation style is a Japanese presentation style. It was created by architects, so each of the presenters is going to have 20 PowerPoint slides, which will run for 20 seconds each. So the idea is to keep the program moving along, because in years past, our research slam got slammed with some folks who had some difficulty with time management. This is
Group had done its job, it would have finished faster.
That's exactly true. So this has actually become one of the highlights of my year. It's really enjoyable to come and to hear my faculty colleagues talk about their research projects. Lots of interesting stuff going on in the College of Arts, Sciences, and Letters. So our first presenter, and I give her great amount of credit because as this is an unfamiliar presentation style to many, and she's going first, is Professor Pam Aronson from the Department of Behavioral Sciences. She's a professor of sociology. And her presentation today is titled, "I'm Not Voting for Her: Internalized Misogyny, Feminism, and Gender Consciousness in the 2016 Election." Please join me in welcoming Professor Aronson.
Okay, so before the highly unusual presidential election merges in our minds with the highly unusual events that have happened since the election, I want to discuss the role of gender in contributing to the outcome. So conventional wisdom has focused on racial and class resentment as influencing the election, and what I want to examine today is internalized misogyny as another important factor. So obviously, people assumed that women would vote for Clinton in large numbers, and women of color did so at around 80%. What pollsters failed to predict was the voting behavior of white women, 53% of whom voted for Trump. So considering educational background, 61% of white women without a college degree and 44% of those with a degree voted for Trump. I've written a book chapter examining gender and feminist consciousness and internalized misogyny. And in it, I've attempted to answer a question that was eloquently described by our history colleague, Georgina Hickey, when she asked, "Why did white women vote for a sexist asshole?" I examine the ways in which the Clinton campaign failed to fully mobilize the gender and feminist consciousness of women voters. Gender consciousness is an awareness of women's political and social interests and makes salient the status of women as women. Gender consciousness is distinct from feminist consciousness, which is an awareness and critique of gender inequalities and patriarchy. Nearly all women, whether feminist or not, have internalized the misogyny of our culture. Because subtle gender inequalities are pervasive, even people who identify as feminists may find themselves unconsciously preferring male leadership. In the election, the notion of a woman being elected as president seemed to repel many women, especially white women. And internalized misogyny and the inability of the Clinton campaign to overcome it by fully activating and mobilizing gender and feminist consciousness ultimately contributed to Trump's victory. So while the public is generally supportive of a woman running for president, not everyone supports this notion. For example, a Pew Research Center study revealed that only 3/4 of both men and women agree that men and women make equally good political leaders. Even a small percentage withholding approval and voting accordingly could tip the balance in a close election. Women candidates face a no-win situation. Many voters view them negatively if they are portrayed by the media as violating gender stereotypes, or if they are portrayed as too nurturing and sensitive. The former is the case for Clinton, who has been criticized for having qualities that are not viewed negatively when perceived in male politicians, including being ambitious and strong. Although many people have entrenched negative opinions about Clinton, who've been in the public eye for many years, there was widespread blatant misogyny during the election. For example, Trump interrupted Clinton over 50 times in the first debate and 37 times in the third debate versus her interrupting him 11 and 9 times respectively. At Trump rallies, it was common to see misogynistic campaign materials, such as t-shirts with the slogan, "Trump that bitch," or pins with the slogan, "Finally someone with balls." Yet many women also embraced these messages. For example, a female Trump supporter was seen wearing a t-shirt with the words, "Trump can grab my," and an arrow pointing down. And it really makes sense for some women, and in particular we're talking about white women primarily, to support Trump if you think about the ways in which their husbands and other male family members are voting for him. So journalist Rebecca Solnit states that believing in equality can make your life unpleasant and dangerous if you live in a marriage, a family, a community, a church, a state that does not agree with you about this. Journalist Nina Burley remarked that the Trump factor not only frightened women, it quieted them. That many women simply kept things smooth by not speaking up. Psychologist Jen Kim points out that internalized misogyny may be present for women who are dependent on men because inequality is easier than challenging patriarchal arrangements. This may especially be the case for working-class white women with lower levels of education, as they have fewer resources and may be more financially dependent on men. So in contrast to all of that, however, I want to talk about a number of flashpoints. I want to talk about one flashpoint in particular, but there were a number of flashpoints during the election when gender and/or feminist consciousness became salient for many women voters. And the most notable of these was the release of the now infamous 2005 conversation with Billy Bush of Access Hollywood, in which Trump bragged about kissing and groping women without their consent. So the subsequent media explosion that happened as 8 million women responded to Kelly Oxford's call to tweet me your first assaults illustrated the activation of feminist consciousness and gender consciousness as well, as women became aware of their interests as women in contrast to Trump's candidacy. So the question in my mind was, how did the Clinton campaign respond to gender-relevant issues in her campaign? And many of her materials certainly did emphasize gender, but as a woman candidate, she had a very hard and very fine line to walk over emphasizing gender and how that was going to be perceived. So my analysis of the airing of TV ads suggests that the Access Hollywood moment was really a missed opportunity to further activate and mobilize gender and feminist consciousness. Although the campaign released at least 2 advertisements, and this is one of them, that sought to highlight Trump's misogyny, they were not aired as frequently as other ads, and they were hardly aired at all after the Access Hollywood tape release. The advertisement called Mirrors shows girls looking at themselves in a mirror while a voiceover with Trump's voice replays his negative statements about women, including words like slob and pig. And another ad highlights Trump's disparaging and insulting comments towards women and ends with an admission that he can't say whether or not he treats women with respect. My analysis reveals that these 2 ads aired less than 100 times after the Access Hollywood tape was released, while other ads, such as Trump can't be trusted with nuclear weapons, were shown significantly more frequently, so 2,000 times, in fact. There were many reasons why the Clinton campaign may not have wanted to highlight gender, and I obviously don't have time to discuss them now, but it needs to be considered a missed opportunity. Women from all types of backgrounds unconsciously internalized misogyny, and the Trump campaign was able to tap into these perspectives unexpectedly among white women in particular. At the same time, we really have to ask whether Clinton could have done more to effectively tap and mobilize the gender and feminist consciousness of women voters. And although certainly race and class play an important role in explaining the election's outcome and are integrally intertwined with gender in many respects, we need to also remember that gender was a decisive factor in the election. That's it.
Yes, the ebbs and flows of this presentation style. I've done the same thing. You get ahead, and then the next thing you know, where did my time go? So our next speaker is Professor Caleb Seifert, who is a professor of psychology. Caleb is a two-year performer. He contributed to last year's Research Slam and had so much fun, he quickly agreed to come back for more, and then we changed the format up on him, so he gets to try out this new style. Professor Seifert is going to talk to us today about emerging ambivalence among emerging adults, how interpersonal ambivalence impacts college functioning. All right, whenever you are ready.
All right, so I'm Caleb Seifert. I'm one of the professors in psychology here. My talk is Emerging Ambivalence Among Emerging Adults, How Interpersonal Ambivalence Impacts College Students. I'm going to talk to you today about some research that I do with some undergrad college students here and some of the findings that we have obtained. But first, let me give you a quick background on attachment theory. So attachment theory presupposes that the relationships you form during development and the relationships that you make as you go through your life influence the way that you cope with stress. This ultimately affects your health and it affects your well-being. We've studied attachment in college students, and we know that your attachment style links to important outcomes like your GPA, your overall happiness level. So you might wonder, why study anything additionally about attachment if we already have good research? In order for me to answer that question for you, I have to give you a little bit more background. Historically, attachment has used the three little bears model of attachment. They say some people are too cold. They're not interested in relationships, and this causes them problems. We call them dismissive. They're usually over-focused on self-achievement and under-focused on connecting with others. At the other end of the spectrum, some people are too hot. Many of you have met these people in your life. They're so concerned with relationships that they can't focus on self-development, on achievement. They're very, very, very anxious that their partners will leave them. And we know in studies of college students that roughly 70 to 75% are actually just right. They're in the middle. They're able to balance autonomy needs, so trying to achieve and build skills, with fostering relationships. And these students generally have better outcomes in college. In the 90s, we learned that actually this way of thinking about attachment is not correct. That when we measure attachment, we don't get three buckets. Instead, what we get is two dimensions. One is avoidance. These are people who like to keep people at arm's length, prefer to rely on themselves. Another is anxiety. These are people concerned with relationships. But that fourth quadrant is fearful avoidance. We didn't know what that was. Fearful avoidance involves interpersonal ambivalence. This is when someone simultaneously has a strong desire to form relationships and is afraid that if they let others close, that will prove harmful. They'll end up hurt. When they do get into relationships, they chronically think, should I stay or should I go? And most of them end up leaving, which leaves them feeling lonely and on their own. Currently, there is no way to measure interpersonal ambivalence directly. What we've done here is we've developed a measure. It has items on it like, I'd like to form connections with others, but I find myself withdrawing before connection is made. Everyone has some level of interpersonal ambivalence, and this measure is designed to complement existing measures, not replace them. In other words, what our hypothesis is that we can directly measure this vector. We think it's unique, but clearly associated with both dimensions, so it's kind of interesting. Unique, but related. Further, we believe it's related to a roughly equal degree. So we've now given the measure to over 2,000 people. When you do a factor analysis, first you start with your eyes. This is called the elbow. And we look at how many dots there are above that elbow. As you can see here, there's not two, there is indeed three. We don't just use our eyes, we do use numbers of factor analysis. Don't worry, I know you can't see these. What's important is if an item loads at less than 20, we don't add anything. These are all the avoidance items. You can see they're all clustered together. All the anxiety items, they're clustered together. And then here's our scale, clusters together. So it's clearly separate from these other factors. However, is it separate in the way we expected? It turns out in our large sample, it's correlated about 0.45 with anxiety, 0.45 with ambivalence. If you plot that, that's about here. And if you run an arrow through it, that's here. To be honest, better than I ever imagined. This is a best case scenario for me. Great, so we show that we can measure it. Measuring it is the first step in proving something, but ultimately we have to ask the question, is it useful? In other words, does it tell us something we don't already know? And from a scientific perspective, does it either predict things or does it help improve the prediction of things beyond existing measures? So here's healthy dependence, and this is just in college students, which is about 700 of our sample. You can see that all the forms of insecurity are negative related. So the more insecure you are, the less able you are to depend on others in a healthy manner. But that doesn't answer the question, does ambivalence add something? And indeed it does. This shows how much more variance we predict in an outcome, and you can see ambivalence helps us. So here's well-being. How happy have you been in the past 7 days? Again, what you see is when you include ambivalence in the model, we get about 6% better at predicting it for college students. This looks at self-esteem. And again, we're looking at the current self-esteem. All three, again related, inclusion of ambivalence predicts another 5%. So the continuing theme is that when you use our scale in addition to existing scales, you're getting better and better and better at identifying people who have problems. And the final one that we looked at is stress-related physical symptoms. This was the one unique finding in that ambivalence was the only one to actually predict who in the past 30 days is experiencing high levels of stress-related physical symptoms. So here are some key take-homes from this research. One, insecure attachments do affect college students, and they can create challenges. They can make it hard to depend on other people, hard to cope. Including our measure improves predictions, helps us better understand the kind of students who are at risk. We need to do more work to validate the measure and continue with the theory, and that's what the lab is working on right now. If you're interested, you want to know more about any of this, you can go to my website here, and we have a write-up as well as the measure if you're interested in using it for research. Thank you very much.
All right, outstanding. Thanks, Caleb. So not too much anxiety or ambivalence so far amongst the faculty presenters. Very good. Our next presenter is Professor Marilee Benor, who clearly brought her her fan club with her.
Oh, yeah.
And Marilee's going to talk to us today about Dolly's mustache and the importance of protein stability. I loved this title when I first saw it, so I'm looking forward to this conversation. Whenever you're ready.
So, when someone claimed that Salvador Dali was her father, they had to dig him up. But what most impressed people was his mustache. It was still perfect. And that's because his mustache is made of protein. The protein keratin. There's quite a story here about protein, so stick with me. So proteins carry out the functions within you. Your DNA is your hereditary information, but the proteins are made of these amino acid polymers. Each of these little spheres is an atom. And polymers are long, long structures that are put together in various shapes. Collagen is one of the proteins that's really critical in your structures. This is an example of silk. This is silk. So silk, we depict in a different way. We show it as the strands in the background because we want to know a little bit about the structure. We can't see proteins, so we have to find different ways to look at them to help us understand what they can do and why they're stable. All right. So this is hemoglobin. Probably everybody already knew that, right? And you can see the little heme groups in here. Maybe you didn't know that. It's a tetramer. This other protein is the delicious enzyme invertase. I say it's delicious because that's the enzyme that makes the soft centers in those chocolate candies. And I've colored that one. Each amino acid is a different color. This is a very stable protein. This is avidin right here. Avidin binds the vitamin biotin. If you eat raw eggs, they bind up the biotin. You have a nutritional deficiency. The other one there is keratin. And because it's curly like that, like a phone cord, you can stretch it. You can stretch wet hair. And you can't quite stretch silk the same way. Now, where do you get your protein? Those of you who have been paying attention know we don't have a food pyramid anymore. We have a My Plate. And the My Plate shows you where you can eat your protein, from vegetable to animal sources. Some people take powders, like glutamine powder. Glutamine is actually an amino acid. But other powders come from eggs or whey. I used to have my own flock of chickens, and this was some of their eggs, so I'm showing off for you. Now you'll notice that one egg in the middle is gigantic, because sometimes chickens put 2 yolks in the tube that goes out and becomes an egg. The color of the eggs is related to their ear color, by the way. Nothing to do with how good the eggs are. But eggs are a great source of nutrition. They have proteins and carbohydrate and vitamins. And the vitamin that I'm most excited about is vitamin B2. Vitamin B2, riboflavin, is the vitamin that you actually see after you eat a healthy meal. Your urine is yellow. You might not have looked, now you will, okay? So vitamin B2 is necessary for all kinds of things. We have information about it because we have a flock of mutant hens, and because they're missing a protein, no riboflavin goes into their egg white. Next time you look at your raw eggs, you'll notice a regular egg is slightly yellow. Our mutants don't have riboflavin, and they die about the 13th day of their development. And so we study these. In humans, the riboflavin deficiency would be red eyes, scabby lips and tissues and tongues. Some of us would have scrotal dermatitis. Others might have something different. But riboflavin deficiency is manifested in many ways. In the United States, we don't see it a lot, so nobody worried about it too much. Now you're probably wondering, how do these chickens, how do they grow and develop? How do we keep this flock going? We actually inject the riboflavin into them. Riboflavin's a pretty cheap vitamin. So we take the fertilized eggs, we inject it, the adults grow. After that, they can just eat all the riboflavin that they need for their healthy development. So the problem with our mutants is this protein, and I've shown it in several different ways. Showing you the amino acids, showing you the riboflavin in different ways, showing you that it's stable because it has these bonds between the strands, very much like your hair strands have, why some of you have curly hair and some of you don't. So we have different ways to study this protein and see if it's stable. Now, a riboflavin deficiency in a chick might manifest as a crossed beak, like that. If you have a vitamin D deficiency, which is very much in the news lately, you develop rickets. So we are really interested in finding out how many people have a riboflavin deficiency. Now, this is a map of iron deficiency, and you can see that in some countries, it's quite terrible, especially in women, pregnant women, and children. We don't have a map for riboflavin because we don't have a test for riboflavin. There's no way to easily check if riboflavin is deficient in these populations. So what we wanted to do was to develop an assay. So how do you test an assay? Or how do you develop an assay? A biomarker is what we want to measure. We want to measure flavins. So to measure them, you take a sample, some kind of a detecting molecule, and you get a signal. The signal might be radioactive, it might be a color, or we even use the enzyme from fireflies and make the resulting product glow so we can see how much is actually there. That's how you develop an assay. So we take maybe a sample like that, our protein, which binds riboflavin, a special molecule that we're trying to design, an indicator, and then we do some math, okay? And then we know how much riboflavin is there. Our research right now is making this special marker. Our assay must be cheap, easy to use, accurate, something easy to test like urine, and it must possess a long shelf life. Now, we know that the other components are very stable, but we don't know if our protein is stable enough, so we have to check it. There are lots of ways we check proteins. I'm going to show you one of the ways that we check proteins. We run our proteins and then we color them on something called a gel. This is new protein. You can see that it's kind of between bigger and smaller. If the protein was not stable, it would degrade and become very small. Because I'm a pack rat, I've been carrying samples of protein around with me for 30 years, from my Delaware days to my New Jersey days, so I can actually see how stable it is. This is the riboflavin itself. I just wanted to show you how pretty it is. It's a beautiful little molecule. It's very tiny. You need the protein to get it to where it goes in you. That's why the proteins are so important in you, okay? Now this is the end. It actually takes a whole group of people to do this work. Chickens don't have mustaches, but they do have feathers. You know that the bottom end, the butt end of a chicken is very soft. Those proteins are made of keratin, just like rhino horns in your hair and your mustaches. I want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Smith, Marinchin. Our chickens are kept at Michigan State, and a lot of students have helped with this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilee. That was great. Our next presenter is Professor Jennifer Proctor. Jennifer is going to talk to us about EDIT, E-D-I-T, capital, media, best practices in inclusive teaching in media production. So, please welcome Jennifer to the stage.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about an initiative that just launched in August called Edit Media, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Teaching Media. I teach in journalism and screen studies, and I'm very interested in the notion of inclusion in media production. So this all came about partly because I served as the chair of the Gender Caucus of the University Film and Video Association, which is the primary academic organization for faculty who teach in film and video. And for years, we had conversations about the problematic content in our student films, especially the replication of problematic stereotypes from Hollywood films and violence against women. So a few years ago, we co-published an article that was a response to an article that had come out 30 years earlier that was decrying the same problems. And in this article, we kind of recognized that nothing had changed in 30 years, and we provided some possible solutions. But meanwhile, as you may have heard in a shocking plot twist, Hollywood has a major diversity problem. And this continues to go on with this huge number of statistics I provided here. The exclusion of people who are not wealthy, straight, white men in Hollywood, both in front of the camera and behind the camera, is staggering, and also has not budged in the past couple of decades. In addition, 2017 presented itself, is continuing to present itself. We've seen this rash of sexual harassment allegations, which is partly revealing the toxicity within the Hollywood industry. So these kinds of things that are happening in Hollywood are very much providing the model of the way you're supposed to approach media production for our students. And that's a big problem, and something that we at UFVA and the Gender Caucus wanted to change. So, of course, this is the model that impacts our students, but we're also recognizing that there are things that we can do to make our production classrooms more inclusive so that we're training students to go out into these industries and change the way they function. So that's where the idea of creating an initiative like Edit Media came in. So this past semester in the winter, I conducted a bunch of research, sent out surveys to students to really identify, students in media production programs, to identify what the barriers for inclusion were for them. 26% of them said that they had felt excluded because of their identity in these classes, largely because there were no examples shown to them that featured people like them. I conducted an interview with 149 faculty in media production programs across the country. 90.5% of those faculty suggested that we need to be doing better to promote inclusion in our media production classrooms. And then I also conducted a series of focus groups with faculty and students around the country, representing a variety of different kinds of institutions and backgrounds, to further identify what are the problems that we are encountering that make us not able to fully include all of our different students in these classrooms, and what are we doing right? What do we need to be doing more of? So all of this research, together with a good literature review of inclusive teaching, led to the development and launch of Edit Media this past August. And Edit Media is an initiative that takes the form of a website that provides a set of resources and tools for faculty to immediately put inclusive teaching practices into action in their classrooms. So one of the main things we developed was the Edit 10, Best Practices for Inclusive Teaching in Media Production, which is just sort of a set of short, pithy practices that we want to encourage faculty across the country to use right away. And some of these are really simple, but aren't actually being put into practice in the way you might expect. So even something like screen widely. Screen examples from media that include people of diverse identities on screen and that are made by people of diverse identities behind the scenes. You make sure that you're modeling to your students that people who look like them or come from backgrounds like them have a place in the media industries. And that's a really simple thing that faculty can do that they're clearly not doing because students have told us that they're not doing it, that can make students see that they have a place. We also developed the Edit 5, Advice from Faculty to Administrators on Leadership for Inclusive Media Production Programs. programs, recognizing that inclusive teaching isn't something that only the faculty can do. We also need hiring practices that provide for the hiring of diverse faculty members. And then finally, we produce the Student 7 in conjunction with, or collaboration with a number of students, which is sort of a best practices for inclusive learning for students. It's something that we can present to students at the beginning of a semester that offers practices for students to be collaborators, to themselves make sure that they're screening widely and being inclusive to other students in the classroom. So the website also has a variety of other resources that are useful within and without media production, simply a big long bibliography of research on inclusive teaching specific to media production. But for those of you in the room who are not involved in media production, there's also a wide range of resources on inclusive teaching in general. So additional teaching resources that point to a whole bunch of different things that can be useful for inclusive teaching, including creating a trans-friendly classroom, dealing with issues of students with disabilities, managing conflict and resistance, which I think we're probably experiencing a lot more of under the current political climate. And then the heart of the website, or what I view as the heart of the website, which is a searchable database of inclusive teaching materials that includes video clips from diverse makers and featuring diverse casts, syllabi, exercises, assignments that can all be searched by keyword. As we'll see in the next slide, an example of an assignment that again could be adapted for use in the classroom right away. Keywords are associated with each of these assignments, so depending on the pedagogical goal you're trying to achieve, you can easily find a teaching resource that would match. And I would mention that a lot of these are adaptable to other fields, so this isn't necessarily limited only to courses that teach media production. And then lastly, I've been involving undergrads in this process as well. Again, a set of undergrads that helped with the production of the Student 7. Jenna Kropel, who graduated in jazz this past year, served as a research assistant, and I'm excited to bring on Zara Colley, who's a comm major, who will be joining the project in a few weeks, helping to make it better. So that is Edit Media. Again, it's living right now as a website that you can visit at editmedia.org, and we'll be working in the future to spread it around to seek adoption, formal adoptions, and endorsements from film schools and media production programs across the country. Thank you.
Thank you all for A, agreeing to take on this challenge, but B, also doing it very, very well. Great presentation so far. Our next presenter is Professor Will Clarkson, who is a professor of physics. Boy, sciences are in the house today. Very good. And Professor Clarkson's presentation is entitled A New Use of the Hubble Space Telescope for Galactic Archaeology.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. I want you to imagine, Marty, that my 10-slide talk is actually 20 identical slides from PechaKucha. Okay, so I'm going to talk about something I've been working on for the last 3 years here at Michigan-Dearborn, all about using the Hubble Space Telescope as a new way to probe what a thing called the Milky Way bulge is doing and how we think it formed and developed. So you can see the bulge if you look out on a clear night in the southern hemisphere. It's this sort of bulge that literally rises out of the plane of the galaxy. And before I get too far with this, I do want to acknowledge my colleagues, in particular, thanks to CASL and the Startup Fund for Natural Sciences for funding part of this, and also some of the students in my research group for helpful discussions. So back to the bulge. Bulges play a literally central role in the formation and development of structure in the universe, and therefore in the way that elements are recycled in the cosmos. The video on your left is showing a simulation for the formation of a Milky Way type galaxy in the cosmological context. Here's gas being pulled in, stars are developing. On the top right is a figure to motivate this idea that bulges are sort of lurking with intent in the formation of galaxies. It's showing you from the literature the way that the stars in the bulge move, this sort of size of their dispersion, against the mass of the black hole in the center of the galaxy. And although it's become more interesting since it's been recognized that there are two kinds of bulge, it's pretty clear that bulges are important for understanding structure in the universe. The problem is that we're inside the Milky Way galaxy, so although our bulge is by far the closest to the sun, we're looking at it through the intervening material. So on your left is a figure showing what we think the Milky Way might look like could you see it from the outside. It's Milky Way analog NGC 4394. On the right is what we actually observe for our galaxy. This is one of the Hubble images I was talking about, and we're looking down a sight line that passes right through the foreground disk towards the bulge that we care about. Now, it turns out that if you have a nice, accurate detector, such as the Hubble Space Telescope, you can isolate bulge stars from the foreground. In fact, we showed back in 2008 that even with a 2-year time baseline is enough. So a 2-year separation between epoch 1 and epoch 2 is enough to watch those foreground stars move in front of the bulge. It's a little bit like looking out of a train window as the foreground moves ahead of the background. But by the standards of modern astrometry with Hubble, this measurement, which is roughly equivalent to watching a tennis ball move by its own diameter in a year as seen from Dearborn in Los Angeles, is not actually stretching Hubble to its limit anymore. And so back in 2008, we thought, well, can we do better than this? Can we actually chart the way that the star's motions vary with distance? And what if someone comes up with a way to tag them by chemical abundance as well? That's what I'm talking about today. So since our 08 paper, a project with Hubble was carried out to actually chemically tag about 250,000 objects in this field of view, using a special set of filter combinations, really, to turn the Hubble imager into a spectrograph. What you're seeing here is the division of the stars in the Hubble field of view, that's the image on the right here, into a metal-rich or a metal-poor sample of stars. We borrow some techniques from machine learning that are extended to handle very strongly varying measurement uncertainty and apply them in this case. I can talk about these figures at the bottom if anybody asks me. I probably don't have time to do it right now. In a nutshell, though, we have a metal-rich and a metal-poor component that we've let the data drive us as to where they are. So in some sense, this is a data-driven approach. When we then ask how do these things move, so we're saying we take the apparent sideways motion of the stars and ask how does that vary with distance from us to the stars themselves, we find that we can draw quite clearly the rotation curve of the bulge dissected into metal-rich and metal-poor stars. And we clearly see a difference in the way that the metal-rich stars move versus the metal-poor. This is tracking from near the sun to far away from the sun. And the metal-rich stars show first off, a larger amplitude switch from the near side to the far side in the way the velocities work. It also turns out metal-rich stars show more organized motion. So this is our main result. The metal-poor and metal-rich populations definitively move differently in the galactic bulge. That's important because this is actually quite controversial. The figure on the top left is showing you what happens if instead of looking at stars progressively along a narrow sight line from the near to the far side of the galaxy, you instead take a sort of fan beam approach and say everything here, everything here, everything here, track across the galaxy. When they did this with the traces they were using, in this graph the red is metal rich, the black is metal poor. That test was not sensitive to this. We are. And so this is just the tip of the iceberg. Recent evolution of this field is now suggesting that indeed we think that multiple populations are present within our own galactic bulge that we think formed at slightly different times in the past, some as recently as 5 billion years, some closer to 10 billion years ago. And as the bulge develops and evolves, we should see kinematic signatures, just like we're finding here. The lower left figure is another example of this, where you can ask, instead of what is the bulk motion, what is the spread of motions? And indeed, there's this fingerprint of more metal poor, possibly older, showing more disordered motion. And so our results are entirely consistent with that. Here's another figure showing you, now from the point of view of the age of the objects, when do we think these stars formed? And in this figure, the red and the blue roughly correspond to our red and blue over here. So we think the metal-rich stars may have formed more recently, metal-poor formed more for a longer time in the past, and that's why their velocities have kind of smeared out over time. So what's next? One nice thing about this approach, using Hubble to really dig deep, is that it opens up a whole new sort of observational iceberg, that's the blue, beneath the tip, which is the giants, that's the red, that are more typically used to do traces. The kind of objects we're now looking at, they're vastly more common on the sky than other giants that are more typically used. And so what I want to do next is to then extend these techniques to actually track 4 different sight lines from the same data set that we've used to develop the method as just one. The idea, just in a nutshell, this figure on the right is showing you 2 simulations, or 2 figures from a simulation showing where these modelers think the metal poor stars, that's the top panel, and the metal rich stars, that's the bottom panel, might be found if you were to look down on our galaxy on the inner edge. In this figure, the red stars are oldest and the blue are youngest. So what I want to do next is to apply this new technique to observe trends across this thing and really compare this in detail with models for how the Milky Way bulge formed. So in a nutshell, that's about it. Watch this space. I'm hoping to get this. This is now with collaborators before submission to a journal, so I'm hoping this will appear in print before too long. And yeah, it's looks like a promising technique. Thank you.
Will is a repeat performer as well, so thank you for agreeing to do this again. Our next presenter is Professor Pat Smith from the Department of Social Sciences. Pat is a professor of economics, and she's going to be talking to you about does self-perceived weight influence the labor market? So no, take your time, Pat. We're doing just fine.
All right. So, you started too fast. Can you go back? All right. So, I'm an economist, and I'm looking at self-perceived body weight and labor market outcomes. Most people look at body weight and labor market outcomes, especially obesity and how does it affect employment and earnings. So instead, we're going to look at how does somebody view their own weight. Most of them look at how does obesity affect employment and earnings, and I'm going to look at self-perceived weight. So we're looking at how does physical health, mental health, and capital accumulation affect your labor market productivity. And a lot of it hinges on how prospective employers view you. They're looking at you and trying to figure out, are you going to be a hard worker? Are you going to be a good team member? Are customers going to like you? Are you going to be expensive to insure? Kind of stuff. And so a lot of evidence shows that heavier women earn less, and this is especially true among white women. And so you don't have to look far on the internet to find evidence of employers discriminating against women on the basis of weight. And saying weight is going to predict all these things about you being a poor worker. So lots of evidence on this. So we started to think, well, what about what the person thinks about themselves? How do they perceive their own weight? We know women tend to over-perceive their weight, whereas men tend to under-perceive their weight. And could this influence their behavior in terms of schooling, training, job search, etc.? And for example, in the extreme case of anorexia, where people over-perceive their weight, there's a lot of serious health problems, cardiovascular problems, psychological problems. And you'll read these stories occasionally about young girls killing themselves because they're sick of dealing with anorexia. They can't see a way out of it. And so this seems like that affects the labor market. Okay. On the other side, you can also find stories mostly about men who are unhappy and anxious because they don't think they're muscular enough, and so they have poor self-image, lower self-confidence, and they engage in unhealthy behaviors like taking steroids, which can influence their behavior in the labor market. So we thought, okay, there's reason to believe self-perception could matter in addition to how the employers perceive you. So we went out and got access to a data set on about 7,000 individuals so we could look at, does their misperception of weight influence their employment and earnings? And we got people born in the early 80s. We can follow them from age 16 to age 31. We look at their body mass index, their weight relative to their height, and we use clinical categories based on BMI of are they underweight, healthy weight, overweight, or obese. We also have the responses to how do you perceive your weight. Are you about the right weight? Are you slightly overweight, very overweight, slightly underweight, or very underweight? And so we can see if people's categories that they perceive themselves match up to the clinical category or not. Are they over-perceiving their weight, or are they under-perceiving their weight, or are they just, have they got it right? And so over aging, as we age, we can see, well, two things. Men are more likely to report thinking they're about the right weight than women. And then the older we get, as we go from 16 to 31, fewer and fewer of us think we're about the right weight. We're recognizing things are going awry. If we look at about the right weight by their BMI category, the people down here are underweight, but 40% of them think they're about the right weight. And up in this tail, these are overweight and obese people, and they think they're about the right weight. And the people in the middle here are in the healthy range, and 70% of them think they're about the right weight, which means 30% of them don't. So weight misperception is pretty common in this group of adolescents and young adults. So now, how does that influence their labor market outcomes of earnings, weeks worked, and number of lifetime jobs? And we run 3 models for each, where we start with just a basic demographic model, age, education, race, ethnicity. Then we throw in measures of cognitive skills, childhood behavioral problems. Were they generally happy most of the time, or did they report being unhappy most of the time? And then we add in our key variable of weight misperception. Do they underperceive their weight or overperceive their weight? And we interact it with gender to see if gender makes a difference. And so in the wage results, we see that higher BMI is associated with higher wages, unless you're female, and then you're going to earn less wages. And our weight misperception variables didn't matter at all. So onward to hours worked, and we're going to see that BMI is again positive. Being female is associated with working 5 more weeks per year. Being depressed is associated with working one less week per year, while being happy most of the time is associated with 1 more week of work per year. But our weight misperception variables don't show up as statistically significant in this regression either. And so finally, we look at the number of lifetime jobs, and gender doesn't matter here at all. We do see our first weight misperception effect. Women who overperceive their weight compared to women who have the correct perception work 0.09 more jobs over their lifetime. So it's marginally significant and practically meaningless. All right? So we've come to the conclusion that while employers' perceptions of weight matter in the labor market, workers' own perception of their own weight doesn't. Thank you.
So by the way, at the end of the day, although it's going to be hard this year, we have a new tradition that we started last year of awarding what we've called the Kiska Award for the person who goes over time the most. They get this beautiful skull-encrusted, timer. And the competition's pretty tight this year. There's not a lot of wiggle room. Last year we had a faculty member who was scheduled to present for 3 minutes, and they went to 8, in spite of my repeated efforts to let them know that they'd gone way beyond. So we'll award the Kiska at the end of today's program. All right, our next presenter is Warren Anderson, who is also a professor of economics. Social sciences in the house. So, and Warren is going to talk to us about elections, gold, and Native American conflicts. Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'm ready. So that's the title of my paper. So basically, there was a paper for 1994 that looks at why violence happened against Native Americans the way it did. And what I want to do is I basically expand on their paper and identify two variables that they did not look at. And one is election cycles, and the second is gold mining. So there are 3 books, and what these books they do is they catalog violent incidences between natives and settlers. And then they just have it in a list with the date and the place. And there are 3 data sources, and so I just call them small, medium, large for sake of ease. And that has the year's number of conflicts. And here is what it looks like per year. And so you can see that you have this wide variation in the number of conflicts between settlers and Native Americans. And so what I want to explain is try to explain why does this vary so much. One variable that I identified is the election cycle. So if you look at the election year, there is a spike in violence against Native Americans. And if you look at these data sets here, if you take the average for these 3 years, it's roughly about 20, and then it goes up to about 30. So you have about a 50% increase of violence in the election years. Now, what I'm looking at here with the election years is based on a work of the Hessen Orphanides. And so in 1995, they looked at U.S. warfare when the U.S. goes to war. And they said that the state of the economy really matters. So if the economy is in a recession and a president wants to win an election, you have to show you're a strong leader, so you go to war. If the economy is not in a recession, then you don't have to go to war because you've already shown that you're a good leader. So basically, I'm copying their work and taking the other work and putting them together for this section. And so if you look from 1830 to 1897, these are my regressions with the different data sets. And you can see that during a recession, violence goes up. So this is a kind of regression you can read those coefficients as like a percent. So for the large data set, violence goes up against Native Americans by about 20%. And then if you truncate the data, you get an even larger effect because violence had decreased a lot by the 1880s. All right, so here we're going to look at the state level. So before this was an aggregated time trend. This is at the state level. So it's costly to go kill people, right? It's hard to kill someone. The natives know the land better. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of money. So why would you actually go out and fight someone? So one reason is gold. So gold was discovered in the West, these 12 states, and you have a long time frame. So 1848 to 1875, you had gold is discovered. And so what I did was for all these 12 states, the first year here is when gold is mined. And so if you look at the number of conflicts, before gold is ever mined, you have very low levels of conflicts. Then afterwards, you see this huge spike. Now, one confounding factor is that maybe this isn't gold, it's just the presence of settlers. So here's some very brief history. So in Washington State, the first settlers arrived in 1843, gold mining 1853, and then you have conflicts after gold is mined, but then you have none afterwards. So in other words, there's no conflicts until there's gold, and then you get fighting. Oregon, it's mostly the same. You have about 20 years of settlers in the state with only one conflict, and then you get gold mining, and then you get 12 more. Idaho, I put Idaho here because prospectors to get to Washington and Oregon went through Idaho, and there were 0 conflicts until you get gold in Idaho, and then again you get skirmishes. Wyoming's the last one. It's the same thing. You get hundreds of thousands of migrants go across Wyoming through the Rocky Mountains. They found the passes. There are very few skirmishes, so there's 6 right there. But then after gold mining, you get 32 over a decade. So these are the regressions. So it's a peniform. So it's like by state and by year, how many conflicts are there. And so you note that this seems wrong because this is saying that there's fewer people killed and wounded. And down here, it's not very significant. So I was a little surprised by this. And then when I looked at the data a little closer, it is due to Custer's last stand. So gold was discovered in South Dakota. And the worst violence between natives and Americans happened in the data fighting over this gold, but the problem is the gold was fought over in Montana, not in South Dakota. So what I do here is I simply drop the Dakotas and Montana, and you can see that now you have a positive, significant, large effect of fighting or gold mining and violence. And then here what I do is I give Montana 2 gold discoveries and the Dakotas 0 because fighting over Dakota gold happened in Montana. And here you get significance at the 1% level for all of these. And these are large effects. Again, So like for this one, so 5 years after the discovery of gold, you have a 40% increase of violent conflicts. Or here, the biggest one, you have a 145% increase of those killed in conflicts between the US and Native Americans. So in conclusion, violence, it can be very costly to engage in, so why would you go fight and possibly lose your life? So here I have two main variables. So one is election cycle, so the president just sends you out, so that way he can look better by saying he's doing something. And the second is gold discoveries, right? It makes it a lot more profitable to go out and fight. And so my last point here is that in this short paper, Lisa and his co-authors, they point out that economists like to use public defense as your typical public good. And so we need public defense, to protect everyone. But they say we overestimate the value of public defense because we miss that public defense can also lead to public offenses. And I think that's relevant here in fighting Native Americans. Thank you.
Okay. Our next presenter was scheduled to be Caitlin Finlayson, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, she unfortunately can't be here today. So Mike, are you feeling ready? Okay, very good. So Mike McDonald is our next presenter, and Mike's talk, Michael is a professor in composition and rhetoric, and his talk is labeled Literacy and Forced Migration.
Yep.
And Mike's also a return performer as
No,
well.
I've never done it.
You haven't done this one? I thought you did this 2 years ago. No? Sorry. Okay. So he's not. Anyway, he's new to it, but he's going to be great. I can tell you that. All right. Thanks.
Okay, we'll see. Yeah, I'm all set. Okay, so my talk is Literacy and Forced Migration. This is a very new project for me, so I don't have any findings or conclusions. But first of all, I'm going to just give a background of two theoretical concepts that are really key to the project, which is literacy sponsorship by Deborah Brandt and Michel Foucault's late career concept of governmentality, which he didn't write a lot about, but others have kind of written extensively because it's really relevant for kind of globalization, issues of migration, and things like that. So briefly, to define sponsorship, it's really pretty obvious. It's very easy theory to use. It's reading and writing. How is it supported? But it's also looking at how it's recruited, regulated, suppressed, and withheld. It's very much a labor perspective on literacy, reading and writing. And then there's Foucault with a cat. And governmentality is really about power and how it's about the state power, but it's also about individual power. So it's about governing mentalities and what it means to be governed or governable. So it's very kind of complex, abstract. So I like to align these two theories together because they have very similar kind of definitions of complexity and kind of multi-perspective, multiple actors involved about recruitment, regulating, analysis, procedures. And so I'm continually drawn to the way governmentality seeks to understand what Foucault would call an ensemble of practices. And this really relates to refugee resettlement because there's so many actors, agencies, parties, public perspectives, opinions involved. So some of the stakeholders in terms of refugee resettlement include the UN. They write the international law. Nation states, they interpret the international law. NGOs, they're all about advocacy for rights. And then we have communities, local state agencies, the distribution of resources, and the refugee voices themselves. So a typical relationship between the state and the NGO is that they share responsibility for distributing resources, but Iowa Ong in 2006 observes that refugees have had to look outside the state for securing their rights, and that'll come up again later. So one way this happens is through the UN Global Compact. This is a way to pair local NGOs with the private sector. So this is a new thing that's happening. Companies kind of getting involved in refugee resettlement and refugee camps. The UN Global Compact operates according to 10 principles. I've just highlighted 2 here. I'm not sure why I put principle 10, but they do a lot of focus on corruption. But the main one is to protection of internationally claimed rights. So a couple of examples. Microsoft of the Global Compact. Microsoft has been working with the Cherokee Nation to preserve Cherokee languages through software and technology. And then IKEA is really big in the refugee regime And one of the things IKEA is also doing is to try to stem child labor. But this IKEA story, you might be familiar with it. It's very interesting. They built collapsible, foldable shelters as an alternative to the military tents that have been used since World War II for refugee camps. But if you notice here in January 2017, IKEA won a Design of the Year award for the flat pack refugee shelter. And in April, a few months later, they recalled a bunch of the shelters because they didn't meet fire codes and they lacked proper access for disabilities and things like that. Okay, another company involved is Pearson, and we're all familiar with Pearson because they do the Common Core and they come to our door sometimes. So Pearson, this is a very interesting Wired article about Pearson taking over the globe with private education. Right now they're working with Save the Children to deliver, and that's their word, effective quality education to refugee children. This is mostly in the form of an app and technology provided to refugee camps. So this is kind of an interesting partnership. Now some critiques of Pearson are that teaching in Pearson's model kind of becomes a low-paid service that requires little training. And some of the things they're experimenting with, critics fear they're going to use in the US after they kind of experiment in the refugee camps. Some other critiques of this idea of like delivering education, Robert Phillipson is a linguist who kind of critiques the donor-recipient model, where education is seen as a commodity that is exported from one place to the next. And so these critiques, they kind of deny local grassroots and just local agency, local self-governance in terms of education. So there's a lot of schools that get hurt by kind of the private enterprise coming in and offering free or low-cost schooling. So I just wanted to look back to that Iowa On quote to show how refugees now must continue to look beyond the state for protection of their rights. And the right to education is one of the core fundamentals that refugees are supposed to be guaranteed. And that's it. It's a work in progress. So there's some sources, and thanks a lot.
Our next presenter is Professor Gabriella Scarlatta, who is a professor of French, and she is going to be presenting to you a talk on crime and punishment in late Renaissance Italy. Gabriella?
Okay, I'm going to go back in time, and we're talking about the late 1500s, 1587, okay? So I just want to put a little bit in perspective my research. I work on a Renaissance French and Italian poetry, on intersection of gender, genre, and intersectionality between Italy and France and what was going on, and a lot was going on there. I'm talking about the Protestantism, the birth of Protestantism, and the Counter-Reformation. So, well, okay. So this is what I do. And while I wait for the next slide, I can tell you that I have looked into this. I just happened to fall into this topic. I was working in Paris at the library, and I found this text that was very interesting of a fact that actually happened in Renaissance Italy. Okay, so this is what I do. It's very important because in 2017 we are commemorating the 500th anniversary of Luther's 95 Theses that changed world history. The title of the article that I wrote regarding this topic, but again, just the very beginning, is Beheading the Elegy, Gender and Genre on the Scaffold of Bologna, and you will see why. So the background, like I said, is the Counter-Reformation in Italy. As you know, Italy is a very Catholic country, but most, for sure, back then, the Council of Trent was a response to the Reformation, and in all city-states in Italy, there was the Inquisition. Bologna is where this event happened, and it was a very important city back then, and the Pope had a very tight grip. The fact here is that Ippolita Passerotti and Lodovico Landinelli were in love. They were in their early 20s. He kept asking for her hand to the father, but unfortunately the father kept saying no, and so they decided to poison the father. And they poisoned the father, and therefore they were immediately detained, sentenced to death, but it was kind of not clear how supposedly Lodovico, his confession was obtained by torture. So the facts are not very clear. But what interests me is that this crime and punishment have been chronicled by many texts, including a huge amount of poems. Like I said, they were both detained, and she was decapitated, something that was not done back then. They preferred to hang people, but because of her noble class, she was decapitated. And as you can see the numbers there, hanging was faster, and 84% of the cases were hung, and only 8% more or less were decapitated. She was decapitated on January 3rd, 1587. He was decapitated immediately after in the public square of the city of Bologna. So the whole city witnessed this decapitation of this very young woman. The scaffold, of course, becomes a very important site in Bologna because that's where her head was cut from the body. And a lot felt that the justice was served, but a lot, on the other hand, felt that she was killed really for no reason. And that is why the city felt so bad that they actually started this poetic competition to commemorate this triple death. And therefore, a lot of poets started writing poetry about this event. And which is a very unprecedented event. And also what happened is that the poetry has been used as textual evidence, while we know that poetry is not really always true to the facts. Therefore, poetry actually started to create a myth around this tragedy. Hippolyta herself became the focus of the tragedy rather than the whole, if you want, triple murder or triple death. She became an example of courage in meeting her execution in the poetry. She was not blamed. He was blamed. The lover was blamed. The father was blamed for not having consented to the marriage. And of course, the city itself becomes a third character in all of this. This is unprecedented because this goes against the literary tradition. Up to now, women are portrayed as very weak and very fickle. Women are portrayed as victims of love, passion, and folly. They are unable to rationally circumvent love's excesses. They always fall, if you want, for love. And therefore, this is a new, if you want, it's a change in poetry in Italy, and that's why I'm really looking closely at it. What we see is, instead of a young woman that murdered her, poisoned her father, we see, on the other hand, a penitent young woman, even if the simple, very strong, very brave, if you want, and repentant, of course, an example of Catholic repentance, obviously. So this is some of the work that I found at the library in Oxford this past summer of poetry written to commemorate this event. We have about 85 poems and many letters, and as well as chronicles about this event. Most of them are in Italian, some of them are also in Latin and in Bergamasco dialect, a city near Bologna. We also have eyewitness account of the competition, like newspapers back then and chronicles. And most of the poems, however, are anonymous, which I also find very interesting. What I'm looking at is two kinds of poetry. One is where where Hippolyta's voice is ventriloquized. This happens when a male author speaks on behalf of the young woman, and the other half, more or less, is when it's the third person account narrative. She did this, he did this, and etc. So we have two different kind of, if you want, poetry, and I'm going to compare and contrast. This is the only portrait that we have of Hippolyta. Like I said, she was in her early 20s, a noble young woman that was also factor in the tragedy because they were a very important noble family in Bologna, and so that had huge, and she was considered of higher status than Lodovico, her lover. This is where I worked for a couple of days this summer at the Codrington Library in Oxford, which is where I found a big volume with the great majority of the poems about this event. And the Codrington volume has all but one text of the event, which in itself is very interesting. How was it bound and how did it get all the way to Oxford? That's what I'm trying to figure out too. The other volume is in Bologna, the city at the University Library, which makes sense, obviously. I'm coming to my conclusions. Obviously, there are more questions than answers. What I'm looking at is the compare and contrast of the text, seeing how much factual information there is, how the young woman is portrayed, how this event caused such a huge poetic response, and why a lot of poems were written down, a lot of poems were simply recounted orally. I'm looking obviously at the intersection of gender and genre, the crime, the execution, and of course the issue of religion. The issue of religion is very important because it's the time of the Counter-Reformation, and basically it seems to me that this young woman was made an example of the perfect Catholic young woman who is decapitated in front of the whole city to show that to show young women and women that you should not obviously divert from the model of the perfect young woman who does exactly what your father tells you. And that's it.
How appropriate for the day before Halloween. All right. So our next presenter is, excuse me, Antonios Koumpias. Okay. And Antonios is a new faculty member on campus, so he should be given an extra round of applause for, agreeing to put himself out there. He's a professor of economics, so the economists are well represented today. And Antonios' presentation is titled Behavioral Strategies to Enhance Tax Compliance in Metro Detroit. Antonios.
Thanks. Thanks for the introduction. Like I said, Marty said, my name is Antonios Koumpias. I'm a professor of economics, and I'm generally interested in what motivates people to pay their taxes. So one of the other things that I'm also curious about is to what extent people have, or people's choices have been distorted by the introduction of the local income tax in Detroit. So the first house was Ransom Gillis House in the Brush Park, and that is an old neighborhood that had more than 300 houses built in the 19th century, out of which we only have 80 now. The downtown area, it's still strong and going, but some parts of the city, like the Packard Automotive plant, have been closed down. Since 2000, we had more than 37,000 housing units being demolished in Detroit, and you can see that the sales price of housing has also taken a hit. Following clearly the beginning of the time series is 2008, where we have the housing, the financial meltdown, and what I was trying to show is the fact that, can I just pause this?
Sure. We have time. You're good.
All right.
We don't give the Kiska to new faculty.
Okay. All right. Clickers, I like those. So the point of this graph is just to indicate that there's this discrepancy between the trend of housing prices within Detroit. So the Midtown area is the one that was able to rebound, but other parts of the city were not. So in some cases, the pavement has grown vegetation so much that you cannot even walk through. And this is a gym where Joe Louis, the boxer, trained. And that was also one of the buildings that was slated for demolition, but it's going to be reconstructed, and they would be a museum of some sort. So within Detroit, the housing prices followed more or less consumer prices, but then took a dip and only to rise faster. One of the reasons is the fact that houses like this were able to profit from tax exemption zones, and those have been helpful in maintaining some of the businesses. So this is the Cadillac Cadillac building in downtown Detroit that was renovating, became a Westin Hotel. However, the introduction of those free tax zones has led to demarcation of the tax base. So this is part of Wayne State University that is also tax exempt. And as a result, there's a difference between the actual taxable value that the city is able to gain and what would have been a taxable value had we had no difference. Here is how this is the effective tax rate within the city of Detroit, and you can see that it's much different across different land plots. And the reason for that is the fact that homeowners were able to have a tax rate being defined by the time of their entry into Detroit. So long-time homeowners are able to enjoy a lower tax rate than newcomers like myself. So that was one of the reasons why my location choice was distorted away from Detroit too. Not that I was able to pay for a house just yet, but had I had the money, I would still be looking somewhere else. And this is very interesting because this discrepancy, those tax rates, are giving rise to lots of variation as to where should settle yourself down. This is a part that's tax exempt. And here is, again, another picture of Detroit, and the non-taxable black plots are the ones that might be having a high state tax value, but nothing is returned back to the state or to the city for that part. Delinquency rates have been very high. This is a delinquent property that was delinquent for more than 25 years, but only recently became available for the city for an auction. And this is where where my research looked at. What could be some behavioral strategies? What could be some just messages you could share with taxpayers so that they can pay their taxes? And at different parts like downtown, this is heavier. Now going back to zones, this would be one of the newer firms that have moved into a Renaissance zone, and like one of those. And the question is, when those expire, would the firms still relocate there, or still locate themselves there, or move out to a place where it's cheaper? And one way of potentially going about increasing the value of the houses is by introducing a land-based tax, like the ones that we don't have yet, that would allow you to improve the building without incurring extra expenses for the cost that you have to incur. So a land-based tax would be just based on square footage. So it doesn't matter if you have a skyscraper or a two-story building. It doesn't matter if that's brand new or very old. But one way for encouraging reconstruction of Detroit is to introduce this land-based tax. And the last image was about the provision of public goods, like in that case it was a water hose. So for those who are preferring a bigger, a more generous public good, or that is provision of higher quality of education, roads, and whatnot, again, a land-based tax would be a more effective way of dealing with that, because within that small jurisdiction, the homeowner would be able to identify exactly how much of, how often or how fast would she or he like the construction work to come and solve the issue by levying an appropriate tax. So the fact that we would be able to have some variation within Detroit would give us the opportunity to locate ourselves where we find the fittest based on our preferences. And I think that was a little faster than I expected, but I don't know if you're able to keep up with my fast speaking, but thank you for your attention, and that's all from me.
And yes, I very much appreciate your willingness to participate being so new to campus, and thank you for for being here. So our last speaker is Professor Susanna Pichina from the Department of Behavioral Sciences. Susanna is a professor of psychology, and she will be talking to you about brain mechanisms of pleasure.
Well, I have to say that I am really happy to be here because in my 11 years at the university, I think this is the very first time that I have a chance to tell my colleagues about my work. So thank you, Marty, for the opportunity. This is really, hopefully, enjoyable for everyone. So I want to talk today about pleasure systems in the brain, and I want to start with a story. In the 1950s, psychiatrist Robert Heath started a controversial program to implant electrodes in the brains of patients that suffer from epilepsy, depression, and schizophrenia. He had good intentions. He wanted to find the area of the brain that maybe was the cause of some of these disorders and maybe find a solution and a cure for these patients. He claims that he had a great success, but that success was short-lived. So he would implant the electrode, activate electricity, and patients felt better. They claimed that they felt better. So in order to extend the benefits of the electrical stimulations, he allowed patients to press a button to receive electrical stimulation. Some of these patients pressed as many as 1,500 times in the course of 3 hours. And he said, what might be the reason why these patients are pressing so much? It must be that they like it. And he claimed, I found the pleasure center. It turns out that 40 years later, today we know that he had not found the pleasure center. There were other reasons why these patients were pressing the button to get this stimulation. But me and others have actually been very much involved in trying to find out what are those brain substrates and neurochemical mechanisms that produce pleasure in humans. So my story is a story about rats. It's not a story about humans. And the first thing that I have to tell you is how I measure pleasure in the laboratory. So if your subjects are humans, then it's an easy task. You just ask them, how pleasurable is this? How much do you like this? But if your subjects are rats, the story is a little bit more difficult. And one solution to this problem came from research by Jacob Steiner at the Hebrew University in Israel. And in the 1960s, and actually 1970s, he actually gave a pleasurable taste sugar to one-day infants, newborn infants. And he actually found that these infants would elicit these reactions that reminded a little bit of smiles in humans. And if the taste was an aversive taste, actually quinine, then the reactions were completely different. It turns out that these reactions are not only present in humans, they are also homologous in other species, and they're also present in rats. So this is a rat that is receiving sucrose directly to their mouth, and this is a rat that is receiving quinine. And you can see the comparison and the similarity between these reactions. So maybe more exciting is if I actually can show you a video of a one-day newborn baby that is receiving sucrose. They are rhythmically licking and taking their tongues out, tongue protrusions. This is actually a primate that is also receiving sucrose, and this is a rat. They are all receiving sucrose and producing similar reactions. When we look at aversion, we see these triangular mouth faces, shapes of the mouth. Yeah, they're clearly not liking it. This is not the only reaction that they elicit. This is one of about 5 or 6. They can also move their limbs. They shake their heads trying to get the solution out of their mouths. And the rats do exactly the same kind of rats. Now, if we look at humans, there is no question of what is the pleasurable reactions and the aversive reactions. There is no question about it. When we get to the rats, we see the same kind of reactions. We tend to imply, or we have to guess that these are telling us something about the effective value of the solution that they are receiving. They're not simply ingestive or rejection reactions. They tell us something about the effective quality of what they're experiencing. As it turns out, these reactions actually are quantifiable, and they increase or decrease with procedures that would increase and decrease pleasure in humans. So for example, when we are hungry, food tastes better. And when rats are hungry, these reactions also increase in number. If we pair a taste with sickness, we don't like that food. And in rats, if you pair, let's say, sucrose with sickness, they completely reject the food, even if it's sucrose, a very palatable food. And the sucrose no longer produces positive reaction, they produce negative reactions. So we have really, good reasons to believe that this measure is actually a measure of pleasure, not just a measure of ingestion or rejection. So I'm going to tell you some of what we have found using this technique about measuring taste pleasure in animals. In a nutshell, I can tell you that, by the way, this is a sagittal view of the brain from the side. This is a rat brain. And we have identified three structures: the nucleus accumbens, the ventral pallidum right here, and at the back of the brain, the parabrachial nucleus. All of these structures are causally involved in the increase of hedonic reactions to sucrose when we stimulate them chemically. I'm going to say this one more time because you probably didn't process any of that. These three structures, we think, are causally involved in the production of pleasure. When we experience pleasure, they don't just light up, they don't just simply correlate with the experience of pleasure. We think that they actually cause the pleasure that one experiences, okay? And I want to be a little bit more specific, and I'm going to tell you about one of those structures and how we went about deciding that these structures are actually causally involved in pleasure. This is a cross-section of half of the brain. So through here, just half of the brain. And this is an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. You might have heard about this in your Psych 101 classes, if you remember any of that, okay? So I am particularly involved in this reaction because when because when you stimulate this area, the animals are very engaged and are very focused in obtaining a reward. So we wanted to see if this area was at all involved in pleasure. So what we do is we chemically activate this structure, in this case with opioids. Opioids are drugs like morphine, for example. In my case, I use a particular drug called Damgo. So what you see here is a blown up version of the nucleus accumbens there. And you see these hexagons that reflect individual microinjections in the brain. We know how far away the drug is activating neuronal substrates because we can measure this with something called immunohistochemistry. You don't need to worry about that. Just know that I have a measure of knowing how far the microinjections are activating the brain. And the colors, I don't want you to be confused. This is not a neuroimaging slide. You know, we don't do that in rats. We do it in humans, but not in rats. The colors indicate increased numbers of hedonic reactions. So right here, in the front of the nucleus accumbens and in the dorsal part, in a highly localized area that in humans is equivalent to a 1 cubic centimeter in humans, but in rats is 1 cubic millimeter. When we inject opioids here, we see an increase of about 200% in the number of hedonic reactions. So we think that this area is very much important for the causal production of pleasure. And this, by the way, this in red here is meant to represent this hedonic hotspot, we have called it. A hotspot because we think it's very important for the production of pleasure. It's very different from the map behind in green. We find a dissociation between pleasure and desire in the brain. While the red identifies pleasure, the green is meant to represent wanting or desire. So we find this dissociation here. In a nutshell, I'm going to tell you one more time that these are the three structures that so far we think mediate pleasure using the same techniques that I have described. We have identified three different neurochemicals: opioids, cannabinoids, and benzodiazepines. We know that these structures are part of the same circuit because when we activate one, we see also activation in the other ones, and if we block one, we block the increase in pleasure. So all three of them are seen to be somehow connected, and there is anatomical evidence that these structures are indeed connected, and we think that they're indeed part of this pleasure circuit. Am I going to get the award today? Am I going to get the award? It looks like. Maybe I'm going to skip this last part. Some of you might be wondering, wait a minute, you haven't really said absolutely anything about dopamine. And I've heard many times that dopamine is involved in pleasure. If you took Psych 101 and studied anything about pleasure, they probably told you that dopamine is involved in pleasure. I have done about 4 studies related to this story, and today is widely accepted that dopamine is not a pleasure neurotransmitter. Very briefly, I'm going to tell you about an experiment that I did with genetically manipulated mice that had high levels of dopamine. In fact, these animals are very much focused on getting a reward. I tested them in a runway. The mouse is here. I raise a door. They run to get a Fruit Loop. These mice love Fruit Loops, and they're cute as they can be when they eat them. They hold them with their little hands, and they absolutely love it. When we look at how quickly they go to get that reward, the extra dopamine mice go very fast, much faster than the controls. They are less engaged in pauses or in reversals, so they're very much focused to get the reward. But when we look at these affective reactions, the hyperdopaminergic mice actually show less hedonic reactions than the control mice. Again, they're invested in getting the reward, but they're not experiencing more pleasure once they get it. So the conclusion is that pleasure, we think, is generated by a network of highly localized opioid, benzodiazepines, and cannabinoids hotspots. These hotspots include the nucleus accumbens, the ventral pallidum, and the paravertical nucleus. And dopamine is not a pleasure neurotransmitter. This research is important because this function of pleasure is at the root of many psychological disorders like depression. It's also at the root of other disorders, maybe like obesity and substance abuse. And thank you to the many collaborators that have been participating in some of these experiments also.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you. And please join me in thanking all of our faculty presenters. And now, of course, the moment you've all been waiting for. It gives me great pleasure to present this year's Kiska Award to Susanna Pacini, who actually surpassed even last year's one. So, well done, Susanna. I don't think this is the spirit in which it's offered. Well, thank you all for coming by today, and we look forward to doing this again next year.